Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Sovereign Sphere podcast. I have with me today Sam Cooper. Welcome to the show.
Great to be with you.
Sam, you are a wellspring of important information. You are a independent journalist, perhaps a hunted man right now in Canada. I think my listeners have probably already seen your work. They probably followed it. What got you into reporting in the first place? Because it seems like it was different work than you're doing right now. Tell us about your introduction into reporting and this new path that you've taken lately.
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of the life story. I was always absolutely voracious reader. My parents were sort of very well educated. My father had been educated with some quite elite people in Switzerland, although he didn't really agree with them by the time he came back. So he taught me a lot about like morals and literature and the world. And I had always, in a way, wanted to be a writer. I was also sort of a big into athletics, very competitive person. And so when it came time to look for a career, I had also, I was a sort of a history, logic, and English major at the University of Toronto, thinking about going into law, also loving the idea of being a writer at the same time. So at a certain point, I said, no law, let's go for writing, and journalism was the way to do it. So I just simply got into community news reporting, worked my way up to daily news reporting in Vancouver. And really, I knew that I had found sort of my calling. I remember in journalism school, we had to do an essay about why you wanted to take this path. And if you won the essay, you'd get sort of a little recognition, maybe even a little scholarship or something, very little. And my essay was about how my father had been, a pastor of the Christian faith, and that was his calling. And I felt journalism was my calling. So yeah, that's from that answer, you could see my background, my motivation, competitive. I love the truth.
Mm-hmm.
I just love reading. I love writing. And that was, I came up as a reporter in Vancouver, and that got me to start diving into rabbit holes of what people know me for, which is exposing dirty finance, corruption, and foreign interference. And so, how did I get from being a daily news reporter to where I am now? After 20 years in the news business, working with the best editors, the best lawyers in Canada, a lot of lawyers, too many lawyers, because all my stories needed to be lawyered. Remember, I had wanted to be a lawyer at a certain time, so that's the type of work I choose. I just felt, after writing a book and breaking, some major national, really national altering stories in a way, I thought it was time to start my own business. And at a big part of that was, I could be the controlling mind of my enterprise. And I knew media was changing. I knew that media was becoming more controlled, whether you're kind of at a left wing rag or a right wing rag or a middle rag, a corporate rag. There's a lot of top down control. So I wanted to do my own thing, and here I am.
Was there a defining moment when you left mainstream media?
Well, the defining moment that people will recognize is I had broken the Chinese election interference scandal. The Globe and Mail sort of very, very consciously piggybacked on my work and got access to similar sensitive records. There's all kinds of lawsuits, what I call lawfare, still going on, but the facts have emerged as being true and proven. Canada is deeply, as some a new book calls it, under assault from China for about 50 years now. And so after breaking big stories and writing my book, which was really the entree into me getting a lot of access to information, my book called Wilful, Blindness in 2021 on the similar topics, it has, without being falsely modest, it has become a textbook that now you can read in the New York Times, ProPublica, the Washington Post. Similar stories about, the model I broke, that is governments like China, and especially China, all around the world use their Chinese organized crime assets to infiltrate societies. And now you can read that in, like I say, the New York Times and the Washington Post. And so in a nutshell, my book launched at #1 in Canada, new. It was a leap of faith to start on my own. Well, not obviously. I'll tell you, it was. You're
Uh-huh.
scared. Can you make this on your own? Maybe scared's not the right word. There's anxiety, there's apprehension, there's other commitments. I had to support people close to me. But I knew when my book was launched on as #1 and I continued to just grind out what I think is excellent work, that was a defining moment. And so when it was time, it was time.
Hmm. I love the title. There's something happening in Canada, this arrogance. Maybe arrogance is the right word. You know, when Trump made the accusation that there might be drugs coming over our border, the pearl clutching that resulted from that. Well, one, I guess a lot of Canadians feel that anything that Trump says is
Yeah.
inaccurate.
Yeah.
But I immediately went to your work, and this is provable that there are drugs crossing our border from the China model.
Absolutely. I mean, it's provable and it's known to the senior law enforcement people who had been, helping me understand this for years that Canada
Mhm.
is strategically chosen as a weak link by Mexican cartels and Chinese triads, especially, both of them with deep relationships with the states where they come from, that is Chinese triads working with the Chinese Communist Party, Mexican cartels having, as Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, said just the other day, capacities of nations. Mexican cartels have intelligence, they have financial infrastructure worldwide. They're like nation states, and they've chosen Canada as a weak link. So I knew this. And you're
Uh-huh.
right. When President Trump made those statements, I knew more or less he was accurate that these networks were using Canada, and that's a national security threat to the United States. Trump often doesn't help himself by maybe exaggerating a little bit or throwing in like a little icing on top of the cake.
Yeah,
And
no
and
tact.
so right? But in terms of your point, there was, I believe, a very, very concerted counter narrative from the Prime Minister's office and Canadian elites that Trump is wrong, no problem in Canada. Trump wants to take over Canada. And as I say, that basically allowed Mark Carney to win the election, which I see as kind of like a psychological operation in itself. So, long story short, yeah, I knew that a lot of what Trump was saying was true in the months that followed. The amount of fentanyl seizures coming into Vancouver and the amount of fentanyl super labs exposed, my reporting on how Canada wasn't working with the United States on these problems completely proved that Trump was more or less accurate.
Recently, you testified on Canada's ethics regime about Mark Carney's conflicts of interest. You know, I was pretty devastated after this election. I couldn't believe that that happened. I thought we had conservatives in the bag. And I read Mark Carney's book, horrified by the ideologies that are in there. But I'm trying to look at him neutrally because I obviously don't want to be in a bad place. I want Canada to survive. So I've kind of been sitting on pins and needles, kind of hoping, you know what? There's 10% of me thinking maybe he
Yeah.
does the right thing. However, his conflicts of interest, his ties to China, and the speed at which he's trying to sever our relationship with the US while tightening our relationship with China really worries me. Should we be worried about that deepening relationship with China?
Absolutely. That is so huge. And I think a lot of smart people in Canada are getting that. It's like we have friends and relatives in the United States. Most of us love the United States. It's like as a people, we're so close. Canada literally, although, the Eastern elites can't see it or admit it, owes much of its prosperity and security to the United States. And a lot of people in the United States, not just Donald Trump, have for years been kind of gently nudging Canada. Come on, you don't really have an army anymore. If a if a
They
Chinese
are our army.
they are our army. If a Chinese spy balloon can and does come over our north, it's a US fighter that has to go up and watch it. And so yeah, these are real issues. And so I personally, I'm like you. I wanted to give Mr. Carney a chance because he's obviously well connected and very smart. At the same time, I do think he's got a dark side to him that he loves to gaslight or maybe has been successful at gaslighting. And I think he did it tremendously well in the election. Stories came out that he was telling Trump one thing. It was kind of like one of those wrestling matches. He's like, I'm really going to be hitting you hard in
Yeah.
campaigning, but I really want to get along behind the scenes. But as it turns out, everything's fallen apart. And yeah, he does and has had deep financial ties to China. And just like the Liberal Party that surrounds him and has surrounded, Pierre Trudeau, Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin, Justin Trudeau, the elites behind those Liberal prime ministers have deep financial dealings with China's elites. They don't want to break those ties. In fact, they're hostages. Their money is buried in China. So if we do the right thing for Canadians and kind of realize that the world is getting more dangerous, we have to put up a wall with China. The elites that support Mark Carney don't want that to happen. So I think what we both fear is, yeah, Canada is getting dragged into deeper relationship with China because the elites, I would say mostly in Quebec, want it to happen. And that's not the country I want to live in.
I'm actually surprised they even brought you in to testify on this issue because you've brought other things to their awareness, which they still haven't done anything about.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I've said before, part of these committee hearings, or maybe the large part, 90% is political theater. And it's not just me saying it. I mean, current or former government officials that have testified alongside me or talked to me about testimony say mostly political theater. But, some good information that is more for the citizens does come up. So let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. But
Mhm.
you're right. When I go in, I've testified 3 times now. And because of the revelations that I've pointed to, which is that mainly the Liberal Party of Canada is compromised by Chinese operations. All parties are targeted, but the Liberals just have that deep connection with China ever since Pierre Trudeau. And so when I go in to testify, there's Liberal MPs that take huge liberties in questioning of me. They're focused not on what I'm there to testify about. They're
Mhm.
focused on past stories, which are true, provable, accurate, will become even more true over time as more information comes out about how bad, some of the things I can't even report for legal reasons. But yeah, in a nutshell, when I go in there, some MPs want information about ethics and others obviously don't. They want to try to take shots at me. And let me take this chance on your show to give a little PSA.
Mhm.
Those records, they're part of Hansard. Those transcripts are going to be there forever. So if I come on to testify again and you're an MP that asks a question and I or someone else proves at some point that someone very friendly to China told you to ask it, I'm going to come after you. I'm not speaking to your audience. I'm speaking to any politicians I know
Mhm.
some will listen. I and my friends in enforcement will come after you and bring you to justice at some point. That's my PSA.
What kind of things did you pull forward in this latest testimony?
So I was asked, does Canada's ethics regime have to innovate and become better at actually holding politicians to account? And my
Mhm.
answer was yes. I said the ethics commissioner and basically all ethical bodies in Ottawa are political appointees. They're toothless. Even if it appears on the surface that they have the freedom to sort of hold Canadian politicians to account for ethical breaches, nothing really happens. And, I told that committee it's the same thing with the RCMP. They will swear up and down that they're, an independent national policing agency, but I know factually that they simply cannot go after potential criminal obstruction cases or potential criminal corruption cases of Canadian politicians dealing with foreign powers, or let's just call them foreign mafias. I know this is happening and the RCMP is doing nothing. So that's what I brought forward. But I think what probably really, really pressed some buttons is I was asked by the MP, Mr. Barrett, whether Mark Carney had any enduring connections to the Chinese Communist Party and to explain my reporting before this election on Carney's business ties to China. So I'll get into that. I'll break down 3 things. I mean, does Carney have continuing ties? I said, I and others reported during the election that he met with a business entity in Toronto. He denied it to the Globe and Mail, who broke the story. And I told the committee that this business entity, who I won't go through all the names that people won't recognize anyway, it does have overt connections to China's United Front, which is, what my reporting in the Hague Commission, etc., basically says. This is China's interference body that's surrounding all Canadian politicians, trying to influence them. So Carney met with them. My further information is that body, I can connect it to illegal casino in the Toronto area, which I further reported, was a subject of both police and Canadian intelligence investigations. I believe this same entity that Mark Carney met with was involved in pressuring John McCallum, our former ambassador, to publicly call for the release of Man Wanzhou. So look, that to me looks like a huge vulnerability. And to your point, like, is Mr. Carney taking us closer to China and away from our natural ally, the United States? When I look at what I just told you, I see a concern there. So,
Mhm.
beyond that, I mean, very briefly, I explained my reporting on how Brookfield, of which Mr. Carney left to become prime minister, had deep real estate dealings in Shanghai that raised a lot of issues with a project going south and the Bank of China issuing over $100 million in a bridge loan to Brookfield under Carney. That
Mhm.
raises, I think, some interesting potential vulnerabilities. But even further, I said Mr. Carney's dealings at Brookfield with a senior Chinese Communist Party official in green sort of business dealings around the world, I thought was an even, probably even bigger concern. And that's a story that's got legs because I don't want to keep rambling forever, but I just saw documents in the Epstein files that have come out that sort of point to this same figure I was talking about who had a relationship with Mr. Carney. So all in all, when I step back, look, that's the picture I was filling in my committee hearing. And if I have to put a headline on it, it's look, China seeks to influence elites in the West, and it does it through finance. And that basically was the message of my testimony.
Okay, I want to rewind a little bit to the Epstein thing. So,
Yeah. Okay.
is it does China have a relationship with Epstein, and Epstein was used to influence political leaders like Carney? Like, what is that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, so this just emerged, days ago. We have a dump of something like 20,000 documents, all these emails between Epstein and all these major people. And so what I reported on for the Bureau is two files jumped out. The first one, how it relates to tangentially to what I just said about Mark Carney. It shows Epstein and Larry Summers, who's a senior Harvard professor and the former head of the US Treasury, major influential economist for the United States, major political figure, much like Mark Carney in a way. So Epstein is texting back and forth with Larry Summers
Uh-huh.
about Larry Summers' relationship with the daughter of this senior Chinese Communist Party financial official. uh, Her name is an economist at the London School of Economics. Larry Summers was acting as her mentor, and he's talking to Epstein about wanting to cultivate a sexual relationship with this younger woman. And so this story has broken, and Larry Summers has sort of had to apologize for his obviously inappropriate conversations with Epstein, who was arrested the day after the messages. But my angle on it is the messages show that this woman, who's part of a senior Chinese Communist family, wants to have the relationship with Larry Summers. So I point to that could very easily be a Chinese influence play with a major US economic figure. And then her father, this is the interesting part. I always start charting when I talk because this is what I do with my stories. Her father's name is Jin Li Kun. He ran the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. This is China's sort of financial system or bank of getting into deals with people around the world and sort of to counter how the West does development deals with other countries. And Mark Carney and Brookfield did major sort of ESG. I believe the entity's called GANZ, GANZ. They're into all these green development deals around the world. Having read Mr. Carney's book of how he's a sort of a green messiah. But look, a senior Chinese Communist Party banker was in these green deals with Carney. So is there any sketchiness there? And as I say, I mean, very obviously, with his daughter getting close to a very senior American economist, there's lots of stuff there on Epstein. I'll add one more thing that jumped out. There's another, people will love this one from all sides of the political aisle because Epstein is emailing back and forth with Steve Bannon. They're talking about this guy called Miles Guo, who is a Chinese, this is quite the rabbit hole in yarn. He's a Chinese, put it this way, I get to step back. My book title was called Wilful, Blindness, How a Network of CCP narcos, agents, and tycoons infiltrated the West. This guy, Miles Guo, is a billionaire. He has self-acknowledged connections with Chinese intelligence. It very much looks like he fits into that world where these tycoons have connections to, let's just call them dark underworld financial networks. and he's getting close to Steve Bannon. Epstein sends an email to Steve Bannon and says, "Hey, watch out for this guy." Basically says, how shall I paraphrase this? If you ever testify in public, you want to make sure your nose is intact. Basically,
Mhm.
sort of suggesting that there could be danger surrounding this individual. So those are just two of the files that are starting to tell me whatever Epstein is, it's a lot bigger than if it's a Western intelligence and compromise story. Obviously, it goes over to China too, and probably other areas of the world.
I heard something really disturbing in your testimony. I believe it was a MP that pushed back on you saying, I appreciate your work, but it's a lot of hypothesis. And then at the end of the day, this might be breaking trust with our institutions. So how do we allow something like independent media to still be out there without eroding trust in government and our higher institutions? And I kind of hear this narrative a lot in mainstream media, when they talk about Pierre. He's so negative, talking about the 2 million people that are using food banks, talking about inflation. He's so negative. And that's what this feels like. And it's just this, we're not going to talk about the problems. It's very negative. We can't have people thinking of us negatively where we're on this side saying, well, fine, stop being corrupt and making bad choices then.
Absolutely. I mean, you hit the nail on the head making that connection. I mean, that was the theme of the election. It was like, how can we have a leader that says Canada is broken?
Yeah.
And that's where the whole kind of boomer liberal, I don't like to categorize people that broadly, but when I step back, there's a generation of people that had it pretty good in Canada. And I say they're the generation that they grew up thinking, hey, Pierre Trudeau is cool and he's loved around the world. And this is our Canada. We're on the way up. We are not those bad guys south of the border. We don't jump into wars all around the world. We're a beautiful multicultural utopia and we're getting richer. We live in areas of Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto where we bought a home for 80,000 that's now worth, 1.5 to 3 million. Like, okay, good for you, but everyone, how many people below the years, the age of 50 can say the same thing? There's a lot of people that didn't ride that wave,
Yeah.
and I do feel I call it a bit of a psychological persuasion operation where you could call it the Laurentian elite, Eastern Canada, or the older people that sort of still live in Pierre Trudeau's world push back on criticisms of Canada. But, what's the counter to that? I'm sure you noticed the story prior to the election of there was a report from the Privy Council office talking about a dystopian Canadian future where
Yeah.
younger and highly capable people start to leave to other countries because they see their standard of living going down.
Yep.
They were saying people may start to forage in the woods because they don't have enough food.
Yeah.
Look, these are real concerns. There are generations that don't see a good future, certainly not equal to what their parents had. And you're right. People at that committee were pushing back on me for
Mhm.
look, I start with documents, I name sources when I can. When I'm talking to whistleblowers that can't be named, I say, yeah, I've been in this for 20 years. My work has started a national inquiry, rather, a provincial inquiry in British Columbia, national inquiry in Ottawa. Look, I've stood the test of time. So if I'm going to bring up an anonymous source saying, hey, Canada, we got a problem. For example, we have a problem that our prime minister stumbled into a surveillance operation on the west coast of Canada where it happens that, suspected fentanyl money launderers were in the room with them and no one knows why. This is a real story reported by the Globe and Mail as well.
Mhm.
Of course, people in the Liberal Party are going to hate me for saying, yeah, I have a source that says this was openly discussed in RCMP units. It's a concern. Our prime minister is meeting with these people. So if you don't like that and you're saying, independent media, fake news, I'm saying, well, how come CBC isn't reporting some of these tough stories? We need a balance. I'm not saying just toss out CBC. I'm saying listen to generations of Canadians saying something, it's not working.
It really is willful blindness. I had an encounter yesterday. I was flying back from El Salvador. I was sitting next to a very nice older man, and we were just chatting, and then he said, "Oh, El Salvador, like, is that safe?" And I said, They're the only country in the world that hasn't had a murder in 1,000 days right now. It's extremely safe. I said I feel much safer in El Salvador today than I do walking in Winnipeg. And
Yeah.
he immediately switched and he got really angry and he said, "That's not true. It's not true that El Salvador hasn't had murders." And I said, "Sir, you live in the murder capital of Canada right now. We have a broken justice system." And he was just vigilant that that was not true, that that was misinformation. And I immediately thought, oh, I better switch. This is a liberal boomer, and he's very protective. But people don't understand. They grew up in a different era, a different time and space, and what was true for that man growing up is just not the case now. It's a very different time and space.
I absolutely relate to what you just shared there. You can tell if people sort of live in their CBC radio world. And
Mhm.
look, I think CBC does good work. I've known a lot of good reporters that I've worked with at other media platforms that work there.
Still.
How could well, yeah, still. I mean, and they know if I'm criticizing like a handful of Ottawa journalists, I'm not talking about all the CBC journalists. I'm talking about the ones that get their access to, politicians and kind of spout their line. But to what you say, absolutely, people are living in sort of their image of Canada, and they're not paying attention to the news stories that I'm saying. When you see, for example, in Vaughan, Ontario, in the north of Toronto, there seems to be a violent home invasion every few days.
Mhm.
People are literally dying. They're literally dying by like 16-year-old shooters. These are real news stories. But what I bring is, I say, why is it happening? Because this is the method of Mexican cartels that, have started to flood our cities. And it's not conjecture anymore. I've done any number of reports for the Bureau. And beyond that, when Justin Trudeau decided to open up Canada's borders with lowering visa requirements on Mexican citizens, the thugs that run that country, unfortunately, the Mexican cartels, started to pour in. And this is just a fact. So to your nice man that turned a little salty when you brought up some problems with Canada. Look, I'm sorry. Do you ever really change someone's mind with facts? I don't know if you do for people, but I hate to put it this way, but if we don't have a population that can start to think about, this managed decline of the Liberal Party isn't working, and we need to maybe consider hitting the reset button with a different party, I don't think we'll have much of a country in 5 years. I really don't.
Thank you for saying that word, managed decline. This has been happening since the Pierre Trudeau Elliott days. Like he had a proposal of this like controlled demolition, this degrowth strategy. That this is what like the more I read on this, it doesn't seem like Canada's ever been the one suited for like economic growth. Like we weren't going to ever be like Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure why, but they seem to have a plan to not let us prosper. And we should be the richest, wealthiest, safest country on earth.
We could be. I've thought that and said it more than once. We could and should be a type of superpower. What that would take would be we would have to recognize our friend and family in the United States, for many of us, may have a different culture, but really deep down, we're very much similar. We don't have to jump into every war they go to, but we need to start recognizing that the world is dangerous. We're in a great place. We could be more profitable. We could be more safe. We could even be more welcoming, but we need to do it in a way that protects what our generations have built up. And we haven't made the political choices to benefit, certainly to our future generations. Unlike you, I have not read Mark Carney's book, but I suspect that a lot of the thinking, again, can sort of jump off of Pierre Trudeau's, founding father. He wasn't a founding father, but we treat him like one.
Mhm.
And I'm sure Mark Carney's sort of, 1970s controlled planning strategies do stem a lot of them from Trudeau's mindset.
It's very Marxist, the whole book, very anti-capitalist, anti-growth, very Marxist thinking.
Yeah. Unless he's getting rich with a Marxist Chinese Communist Party banker in his green deals, right?
I just get such a kick out of more left-leaning individuals and Canada being anti-billionaire. Those billionaires are always just hiding all their tax money and not distributing it to the poor. That's Mark Carney, right? Like he's got a goal of joining the billionaires club. He's evaded taxes more than anyone here in Canada.
He's a model of tax evasion, not illegal tax evasion, legal tax avoidance. And as you mentioned it, our former NDP leader, Mr. Singh, I mean, who has seen him with wasn't he sporting a Rolex? It's like,
Yeah. What do they call him? The Maserati.
there you, I like that. That's a good label. Nice guy, though. Good hip hop sense.
You must be so frustrated bringing all these things to light. Like, if I were in your shoes, I would think, well, and I guess I've been here with this show. Well, I clearly just the people don't know. And when we bring this information forward, then the problem will be fixed and then we can move forward. But looking around at Parliament, for example, right now, are there currently people in the Liberal Party, MPs, that have strong ties to the CCP who have been infiltrated?
The answer to that question is yes. The answer to the question to go further, I mean, are there people with ties to India? Yes. Are there people to
Mhm.
ties with Khalistan, which is a part of, the Indian population at war with the Indian government? Yes. And that brings me to the point. Like, I mean, am I frustrated? There's an element of frustration. There's also an element of in my nature that I won't give up. I'm competitive. If I will let the reality and the truth around me change as the facts change. But I wrote in my book, Wilful Blindness, that Canada needs anti mafia or anti racketeering laws like we have in the United States. We lack them in Canada. We don't have foreign interference laws. And so what's happening, as I wrote for the Bureau just a couple days
We
ago,
don't have foreign interference laws?
no, it's if you remember the findings of the NSI COP report that blew people's
Mhm.
minds in 2024. Let me dive into this. It said there are politicians that are meeting secretly, during or before elections with foreign missions. There are politicians getting paid in clandestine ways by foreign missions. There are politicians that are sharing sensitive information with foreign governments. There was a former politician met with a foreign intelligence agent. I have an idea of all these, who these people and cases are. Another case that didn't come out, there was a politician that promised the government of China they would attack fellow Canadian politicians who were critical of China. So does that sound like a treasonous act or a traitorous act? You're attacking an elected official on behalf of China. Do we know that person's name? I mean, I'll leave it there. But the point of NSI COP was a lot of these things are or should be illegal, but may not even be illegal because we lack foreign interference laws. And that's still the case. And on the racketeering side, where I was going is, again, why the Mexican cartels, Indian transnational gangs, Iranian, using Hell's Angels to attack Canadian people. This is happening. Why is it happening in Canada so bad? Because we lack these laws. And now in British Columbia, as I and others have just reported, the BC Law Society publicly warned its members that they are subject of serious threats from the Indian transnational gang networks that essentially have been classified as terrorists now by the Liberal government. I say the problem if lawyers who are essentially a part of governments in a way or courts are being attacked by the same gangsters that are like trying to surround and influence our politicians, dealing fentanyl, it shows our system is deeply under attack and the problems are coming home to roost in Ottawa, right? That is very close to home. And am I frustrated? I'm not trying to say I'm the prophet here. I'm just saying I've made some recommendations that haven't been followed, and Canada's problems are getting worse. Are people like me, people like, I won't, thinking maybe you'll have to move to the United States if you want to keep, if you want to be prosperous and safe. I don't know. Certainly, these are thoughts that in my mind, if you ask about frustration.
Sometimes I wonder if it doesn't change, not because people don't want to, but because we can't. Like, it goes that deep, our dependence or our intertwinedness with China, that it's so much worse. And I know that so many more things that you can't speak to, also because of lawfare. But maybe that's where we're at. It is so deep and such a problem that we actually can't get out of it. So you maybe even have well-meaning politicians that get into this, they find out about how deep these connections are, and there's actually just nothing they can do about it. I'll say in a democratic way. So in El Salvador, for example, I was interviewing some of the former police chiefs, wonderful people, excited what the country is doing right now. But he was saying when Bukele got in, part of dealing with the gangs was he got rid of everyone that was in not just upper government, but upper police force, like senators, judges. They made everybody retire because the whole system was corrupt. And he didn't go about it in a democratic way. He's not an authoritarian way. He's not an authoritarian, but it was a really heavy-handed approach. He just went in there with like a blowtorch and like took the whole system down.
Yeah.
That where we're at, like would it require something like that as opposed to a democratic slow weeding out the individuals in order for us to see real change here?
Yeah, my thinking, and I think about this a lot, is we are not yet Mexico or Venezuela or where El Salvador was, but those the worst and most brutal, lethal crime networks in the world from those countries have been flooding into Canada. This is a fact, right? The
Uh-huh.
Chinese Communist Party, ever since Pierre Trudeau, in a much more subtle, sophisticated way, has been surrounding our politicians. So I do think, and I wrote this in the update of my book, that we are on the path of elite capture and something called state capture. And what that is, you can be living in a country, like if you've ever gone down to Mexico and you talk to, a nice people and a nice person in your hotel, and I remember having this conversation. I was like, how come I can't walk 10 feet without, someone in Cancun or Playa del Carmen, like basically walking up with a bag of dust, white dust to me and trying to force me to buy something.
Mhm.
And the guy says, look, they own it. They own it. It's
Yep.
very sad. They own this. They take over parts of the economy, literally oil, avocados. And this is starting to happen in Canada. We're on that scale. So what does it take? I say it takes the laws I've recommended. We need a racketeering law. We need to start giving Canadian intelligence and police the power to actually prosecute corrupt, elite, influential people. And some of those people are gangsters. Some of those people that are involved in our political parties. And I won't name names here, but
Mhm.
it gets deep and it gets high in terms of the elites in Canada that have dealings with foreign gangsters. I'll just say that that is 100% accurate. My sources in Canada and the United States know this. They're concerned about Canada. A book came out where a former Canadian national security analyst, I've written about this on the Bureau, his name is Dennis Molinaro. He talked to people in the United States. He asked them, how do you look at Canada? And they said that the memorable quote was, they didn't want to use the word a joke, but they used the word, was it saturated or trying to stay afloat? China is just that much into our systems. So
Mhm.
what does it take? The laws I'm saying about, and we need to work more hand in hand with the United States. I say, even if that includes giving up a smidge of sovereignty to work hand in hand to make our law enforcement tighter with the US while we handle our problem, I would take that over being endangered by Chinese and Mexican cartels taking over our systems.
100%. And I know this foreign interference happens on the left and the right. They've also targeted, conservative leaning members, but it is obviously disproportionately happening within the Liberal Party. What is it about the Liberal Party that makes them exceptionally vulnerable? Is it the connection to globalism that, we're they don't really believe in nationalism or patriotism in the same way that like conservatives do? Is it ideologies where if you accuse someone in China of being a part of the Communist Party, that's racist. What about the ideology or the party makes them so vulnerable compared to the right?
I mean, that's a great question. And you bring up something that I've just started to turn my mind to. You can see patterns around the world where left leaning governments, and I'm not even like making a value judgment about the ideology. What I'm saying is the Chinese Communist Party, Cuba, we'll leave out Russia because they're complicated. They go for both sides. But
Mhm.
China, we'll keep it on the Chinese Communist Party. Ever since Pierre Trudeau, they had a very early success in influencing a Western leader with Pierre Trudeau. This is fact. There were major operations targeting Pierre Trudeau. And so that has continued in Canada with that sort of opening of the door to the Chinese Communist Party almost seeing them as a counterbalance to American capitalism and world influence, that has become too much a piece of sort of the liberal or left wing intelligentsia in Canada. But it's happening the same in other countries, whether it's the United Kingdom, when Australia has leaned a bit to the left, they've gone a little wobbly with China, same in New Zealand. So it does seem to be, I do think, on an ideological basis, China has funded and worked with Western Marxist groups. So yeah, that's part of it. We see the same thing on our campuses. I could go on and on in how sort of it's very interesting when you see people like of from Chinese cultural groups supporting sort of the Hamas or Palestine, movement.
Mhm.
There's like interesting interconnections there. And I think I and others have started to see that sort of Chinese influence is in that is a cause. But to your main question, why do the liberals seem more susceptible to foreign influence? They're in power, or have been about 70 or 80% of the time. So they're always going to be a bigger target. Is it a chicken and the egg type thing where they've held on to power because they're very open to sort of, foreign forces? I don't know exactly, but at the end of the day, yeah, everyone is targeted, but they're just a hugely successful political operation. And I think they don't have many inhibitions to being willfully blind to things that aren't that good to Canada. I've come to that opinion.
No, I think a lot of higher level liberal officials too look to China and want what they have. They want the top down control. They see the economic prosperity. They see that side of things, but then they like the troll. They like the control, and we're seeing that as we move towards things like digital ID. Now, when I look at China, I've had friends that have visited China recently. I've only been for like 24 hours once. Being the devil's advocate, I can see why China possibly needs more control just with the sheer amount of people. Could you actually have a country with this many people with independent thought? I don't know. It's an interesting experiment. Canada doesn't have to emulate these things with our population size. Like we can be a nation of freedom, but it's two things. I think either we don't have a choice because we're in so deep and we're past the point of no return, or it's what they actually want. They want a culture like China. And I think it was Bruce Party that spoke to this. There's people like you and me who are independent thinkers and believe more in independence and freedom and sovereignty. But the culture of Canada isn't that. Like, I think the culture of Canada is primarily that liberal boomer mindset where it's okay to have a big government that takes control.
Yeah, I mean, the I it's not my main channel of reporting, but I do think in commentary, there's something very different to being, brought up in the American system where that sort of independence and freedom thinking,
Mhm.
people around the world recognize that. And it can be obnoxious at times as well.
Mhm.
It can be it can get a bit shrill. But at the same point, my American friends have recognized that Canadians, and I would say especially older Canadians, just seem so content to go along with whatever their government's doing and so trusting that when something does go off the rails,
Mhm.
they're just not ready to question their government at all. And I think gets back to what you say about your encounter with the nice older gentleman that when you said something's not nice in Canada, it was like ice, right? And
Oh, he turned
yeah,
he was so nice too, let me use his phone charger before, and then just that moment, I'm like, "Oh, he
and
snapped."
the elbows went up. No, I do think, yeah, again, I think a lot of this is part of our education too, in terms
Mhm.
of thinking back, grade school, high school, our civics classes. I'm just questioning more and more sort of the assumptions that I bought into as well.
Mhm.
I think that's a good thing to do when you see that your country is not going in a good direction for younger generations. There should be that ferment of thought and asking, can we pick a better path?
It's so palpable, this, like, slow degradation of Canada, but the West in general, like, we can all feel it. Everything's getting worse. Everything like drugs, crime, cost of living. It was interesting to be in what's still a third world country, but there's so much excitement and there's so
Yeah.
much optimism because things are on the up and up in every way. It was a really interesting experience to have. Now, circling back to Mark Carney and this government, it seems like they're gonna be here for a while. They just got their budget approved. Are there things that you're looking for in terms of actions that Mark Carney's going to take where, if Mark Carney does X, Y, and Z, maybe we're gonna be okay and this isn't so bad. Or if Mark Carney does C, D, or F, this is like the point of no return. What specific things are you kind of waiting, watching for?
Yeah, like you from the start, I was very open to the idea that Mark Carney is such a smart person, as everyone knows. And I'm not even being facetious. He obviously, even Donald Trump seemed to like him and recognize that he's a talented person. But as time went on, why in the past few weeks is Mark Carney and Anita Anand, the foreign minister, saying, we will be a strategic partner with China? That's a death wish. That's an absolute death wish. Days after they made that statement, I noticed that Japan's new prime minister, a woman, made the very reasonable comment that if China's army invades Taiwan, Japan may need to take some actions to protect itself and see that as a military threat to its existence. Which, if anyone that knows Japan and Taiwan would see that that's just common sense.
Uh-huh.
And Japan seeing Beijing become more aggressive and threatening and expansive in that area is sort of rejigging their former only defensive military thinking posture and thinking, we need to be ready. What happened? A Chinese diplomat in the city of Osaka said that she should have her head cut off. How dare she? Right? So I want people to understand that the world is becoming more geopolitically dangerous. Russia and Ukraine isn't going away. A war in Asia could be coming. The United States is preparing for that. And meanwhile, Mark Carney's going closer to China. You asked what would change my thinking? If he gets a deal with President Trump, and I think we all can admit that won't be easy. Trump's a hard bargainer, but I say they are our friend. Whatever rhetoric's
Uh-huh.
going on in Washington and Ottawa, the people of Canada and the United States, the trade between us will always be a foundation of North America. It's
Uh-huh.
foolishness to think otherwise. So if Mark Carney, disappoints his elbows up base and says, hey, okay, I've made a deal and yeah, we're going to get along. No, we're not going to get closer to China. For me, okay, it's good. I would support that, of course. I
Uh-huh.
don't care if he does that or Pierre Poilievre or someone else becomes conservative leader. Just get a good deal and keep our security and prosperity in North America and get Canada on a better, more dynamic path, right? Both in the
Uh-huh.
way we do business, in the way we develop our resources, in the way we allow our people to be free thinking, and in the way that we're multinational, but we're going to be more cohesive as a people. We're not going to be people from all different nations, representing their own nation and not Canada. So
Uh-huh.
if Mark Carney goes in that direction, I'll say, okay, you're the prime minister, If he doesn't and the liberals can never be defeated and they kind of, as I said before, if they psyop their way into becoming a one-party state that can never be overturned in elections because of the way Canada is controlled,
Uh-huh.
yeah, I will probably look at leaving this country. I'm not there yet, but I'll lay it on the line. That's the way I see things.
I try and take a step back from everything when I look at it. There's a lot of people in the space that are very doom and gloom, and I like to pretend that I don't have a crystal ball. I do think Mark Carney could go either way. If he is the Mark Carney of his book values, that's a very scary future for us. But I think it's a little bit of a grift, and I cannot prove this, but I think, well, I know that Mark Carney is someone that enjoys being wealthy, and we can see that with his stocks. Moose on the Loose is doing a very good job of tracking all of his stocks, 91% of which are in the United States. In the last 6 months, some of them have gone up 65%, 75%. He's using his prime ministership just to get himself wealthy. That is true. And this is the part that I can't prove, but I don't think he's a dumb man. I think Justin Trudeau was. I don't think Mark Carney is a dummy, and I think this is a long game. And I think he's really like playing up this feud with Donald Trump. I wouldn't be surprised if Trump's in on this. That is also just political theater. When you look at Mark Carney's investment portfolio, I have a sense that that's a total grift. That Trump's in on it too, and Trump would be happy if Mark Carney stays in power, and they're not actually fighting, but they're continuing the fight publicly to maintain his place in power. I cannot prove that, but my gut is kind of telling me that. So at the end of that road, what does that look like? He's going to get a deal, but he needs to amplify the fight with Trump in order to stay in power to scare all the liberal boomers. That's just my thought.
I mean, all options, I agree. All options are on the table, and I don't know which one is the right one, but there's such confusion from the last election why Trump kept pushing the button with the 51st state, which
Mhm.
was obviously helping Mark Carney get elected. That raises kind of like, what was Trump really up to, right? He's very clearly a strategic person. He's also a person that likes to troll, so I don't know if he just
Yeah,
couldn't stop trolling. Um,
maybe a bit of
does
both.
yeah, no, I mean, we know that I think Trump wants to even before I think he tweeted a AI picture of himself on Mount Rushmore, I told my friend Jason James, I think he wants to be on Mount Rushmore. So I do think that no, I think he's driven by history. He wants to be seen as one of the great American leaders and presidents.
100%.
100%. So
Yeah.
that is kinda that's the angel on his shoulder, which will be talking to the other one that wants to benefit himself and his family. And, does he want Alberta to break loose and become, another oil,
Uh,
extend the American military posture north and bring in more resources? That could be in play. Like I
mhm.
honestly, it's such an interesting time. And like you, I like to think about the future, but I like to have the humility to say that it's too complicated. I can't
Mhm.
say exactly what's going on.
Yeah, and I think we all get wrapped up in the daily details, the horrifying news of the day, but I think this really is a long game. And I think where I'll be able to sigh a breath of relief is if he opens up LNG. And I really think he's a businessman. And if he does that, I think it's going to happen later. He needs to string this along a little bit longer. He needs to build up the fear in Trump. I heard this the other day. Pierre could never be the one to say, like, we have to let go of the green agenda and we have to open up oil and gas reserves. It could never be him. The only person that can actually do that is Mark Carney. And he can do that if he just amplifies the hatred for the US and this fight with Trump until eventually he tells the people, you know what, I tried. There's nothing I can do. We're in a bad spot, but like we don't have a choice and I'm going to do this for Canada. It's the best decision. And then the Canadian people will finally also be open to the idea that they can let go of this like green agenda and do something practical for the country. This is the most positive spin I can possibly think of.
Yeah.
Or he's evil and he's destroying the country, but I'm gonna wait and I think it's the long game.
I mean, I like your thinking there because I did I remember thinking that I want to give him the chance to be like Trump. I get the feeling that he would like to be seen as a transformational Canadian leader.
Yes.
Obviously, like, his resume is as good or better than any Canadian prime minister ever, and you're right. He can say things and bring along the liberal boomers that would never go there with
Yep.
Polyev. The carbon tax being with the stroke of an imaginary pen, being very Trump-like, he could
This
say,
fake executive order.
yeah, that's a good example of what we're
Yeah.
talking about.
Yeah.
Polyev could never do that. They would have, sent him to Guantanamo with their elbows up. I mean,
Yes.
but yeah, no, I agree with your thinking there that there's a lot of angles that he could take and, depending on the lifespan of our older generations, he could be in power for a long time.
Now, last question, because I know you're a busy man, you got places to go here. You're kind of getting attacked on all sides. Do you worry about these censorship bills? Like, I know you play it very, very safe with your reporting in terms of like what you can and cannot say legally, but do these new bills, like the hate speech bills, any of this, does it worry you and your ability to report with the bureau?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it gets back to, what we were talking about how the Chinese Communist Party infiltrates left-leaning governments. I mean, I can tell you directly that because I was looking into the election interference story, and I was looking very closely at some people I had been following since writing my book, basically a Chinese Communist Party media cells in the Vancouver area, they're involved in very complex election operations, and I also read one of their, let's call it a document that said a liberal government will put forward has promised to put forward the online hate act bill within 100 days of coming into power. Why is that important to me? That same group had tried to cancel me when I did a story showing how their Chinese Communist Party United Front cells had taken PPE from Canada during the pandemic. I became a subject of letters to the senior managers of the company I was working for saying I'm involved in hate and hate crimes for this very truthful reporting, right? So that showed me that, yeah, those people are trying to push a bill like that. Now I jump back into my international thinking. In South Korea, there's a very left leaning government that appears to have a lot of Chinese communist infiltration. And they have now come up, I believe, with a bill where criticizing the CCP could be hate speech. No, it's real.
Don't be so
It's
negative.
very real. This is happening in governments around the world in different ways. So back to myself, yeah, I think about this threat very much for years, but within the past year or two, I
Mhm.
have, and I've actually taken the step of moving my company that runs the bureau to the United States. So that gives me, some more protection in terms of freedom of the press, even though I'm working from Canada and I'm Canadian.
Hmm. I'll have to pick your brain about that afterwards. Might have to do the same thing here.
Yeah, no, it's funny. Well, it's not funny, but I remember when sort of the Digital News Act or all these different acts that came up under the Trudeau government, various people in our independent space, many of them, former National Post or Maclean's journalist I'm thinking of, kind of joked, oh, it's time to set up a corporation in Delaware. Well, I have actually realized that it is time to do it.
Yeah, 100%. Sam, I really appreciate you coming here today. How can people support your work at the Bureau?
Yeah, so I've got my website that's platformed on Substack. You can just go to thebureau.news on your Google search browser or your AI, and you can sign up. I'm at over 30,000 non-paying subscribers now. I'm getting to a level of paid where I can sort of pay my bills and think about maybe even traveling and doing some international reporting, which is something I'd like to do. So thebureau.news, and I am also on X at Scooper Cooper. But I say go to the bureau because that's where I drill down. I put all my journalistic capacities of 20 years into that website. Whatever you read there is going to be true, factual, and impactful.
Amazing. Okay, I'm going to link that up in the show notes. I'll link up your book as well. And I'd love to bring you back. I'm sure by the time I bring you back in a little bit, there'll be something new and mysterious, horrifying that will come up that
Yeah,
we're going to need to talk about.
more Epstein files, I'm sure, is going to get more interesting. So yeah, it's been great talking with you. I'll come back for very gladly.
Thank you, Sam. All right, everybody. I hope you love this week's episode. I just want to do a little PSA here at the end, a little plug, not for myself, but for Sam. I hope this isn't the case, but I believe that our ability to have these conversations are extremely vulnerable. I don't know if independent journalism and independent podcasting and shows like this are going to be available forever. I don't know. These censorship bills that are coming down the pipeline, they're real, they're scary, they might change, they might be stopped. But in the meantime, I want you to consider supporting Sam's work at the Bureau. If you can't do it monthly, there are options just to do a one-time donation. I know everybody is kind of stressed for money these days. A little bit from a lot of people goes a long way. So if you appreciate real journalism and you want more truth to come to light, if you're in a place to do so, please consider supporting Sam's work. I'm not even going to plug myself today. Sam is just doing an exceptional job. So I've linked those links to the Bureau as well as his book in the show notes. Please pop in, take a look, maybe start off as a free subscriber. And if you value independent media and the truth, and again, if you're in a position to do so, please consider a one-time small donation or something recurring if you are able to. Just wanted to say that, guys, and I really appreciate each and every one of our listeners. A free way that you can support my work is simply just to share the show. Hit the subscribe button if you are on YouTube, same on Spotify. I am committed to bringing as many of these amazing speakers online as humanly possible while I still can. So if you guys just shared this episode, if you left us a review, if you share any of that good stuff, it helps me a ton. It helps me keep the lights on. It encourages me to continue to do this work. Thank you so much for listening, everyone, and I will see you here for another episode soon.